When Sarah Mitchell first met her husband at 15, she never imagined she'd one day be standing in her kitchen in suburban Denver, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. But there she was, 22 years later, surrounded by the chaos of 7 kids and feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her entire marriage. It started so differently. Sarah was the bright, bubbly cheerleader type, always optimistic, always seeing the best in everyone. David was her complete opposite. Quiet, methodical, the kind of guy who thought everything through twice before making a decision. Where Sarah was spontaneous and social, David was steady and serious. They were like magnets, drawn together by their differences, spending every possible moment together throughout high school. They got married at 22, both convinced they had it all figured out. Sarah had always been good at everything: student council president, honor roll, the girl everyone came to for advice. David had dropped out of high school but had this incredible work ethic and business sense that impressed everyone who knew him. They were going to be different from other couples. They were going to make it work. But somewhere between the wedding bells and the baby cries, things started to shift. David threw himself into building his landscaping business, working 16-hour days to provide for their growing family. Sarah found herself managing everything else: the kids, the house, the schedules, the appointments. At first, she told herself she was being helpful, taking care of the home front so David could focus on building their financial security. "I can handle it," became her constant refrain. When David missed dinner because of a work emergency, Sarah handled it. When their oldest son needed help with homework and David was still at the office, Sarah handled it. When the washing machine broke and flooded the laundry room, Sarah handled it while David was out on a job site. The problem was, the more Sarah handled, the more David seemed to step back. It wasn't that he was lazy or didn't care; he was working himself to the bone to provide for them. But at home, he started looking to Sarah for everything. What should they have for dinner? Which preschool should they choose? How should they discipline the kids? Sarah found herself making all the decisions, and then resenting that she had to make all the decisions. "Why do I have to think of everything?" she'd snap at him after a particularly long day of managing 5 kids under the age of 10. "Can't you just take some initiative for once?" David would look at her with this wounded expression that made her feel terrible, but also more frustrated. "I'm working 12 hours a day to keep this family afloat, Sarah. I thought you wanted to handle the house stuff." "I want a partner, not another child to manage," she'd shoot back, and then they'd both retreat to their separate corners, hurt and confused. The fights became more frequent as the years went on. Sarah felt like she was drowning in responsibilities while David seemed oblivious to how much she was juggling. He'd come home exhausted from work and want to relax, while she was still running around getting kids ready for bed, packing lunches for the next day, and trying to keep up with the endless demands of their household. The worst part was how David seemed to have energy for everything except family life. He'd joined a cycling club and would disappear for hours on weekend mornings, leaving Sarah to wrangle all 7 kids alone. He'd stay up late working on business plans or watching sports, but claim he was too tired to help with bedtime routines. It felt like he was choosing everything else over them. "I feel like I married a stranger," Sarah confided to her best friend Lisa one afternoon while they watched their kids play at the park. "We used to be best friends. Now I can't even remember the last time we had a real conversation that wasn't about logistics or problems." Instead of the man who used to make her laugh, who used to ask about her dreams and opinions, Sarah got a man who seemed to view her as his personal assistant and chief operating officer of their family. David would come home and immediately start asking questions. "Did you call the school about Jake's grades? Did you schedule Emma's dentist appointment? Did you figure out what we're doing for your mom's birthday?" Sarah felt like she was being interrogated instead of greeted. "Hello to you too," she'd say sarcastically, but David never seemed to catch her tone. He'd just nod and move on to the next item on his mental checklist. The breaking point came during what should have been a happy time. David's business had finally reached the point where he could sell it, and they'd made more money than Sarah had ever imagined possible. David was talking about starting fresh, maybe moving somewhere with better schools for the kids, taking some time to figure out what he really wanted to do with his life. Sarah was cautiously optimistic. Maybe this would be their chance to reconnect. Maybe with less work stress, David would be more present at home. Maybe they could remember why they fell in love in the first place. They decided to take a family trip to celebrate something they'd never been able to afford before. The trip itself was wonderful. The kids were thrilled to be staying in a nice hotel, and David was more relaxed than Sarah had seen him in years. On their last night, they got a babysitter and went out to dinner alone, their first real date in months. "I'm proud of us," David said over dessert, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Look at what we've built together. 7 amazing kids, financial security, a good life. We did it, Sarah." For a moment, Sarah felt that old connection flicker back to life. But then he started talking about his plans for their future, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she wasn't really part of them. "I'm thinking we should move to Colorado," David said. "I've been looking at some properties online. There's this great area outside Denver where we could get a lot more house for our money. Better schools, clean air, room for the kids to run around." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Colorado? David, we can't just uproot the kids from everything they know. They have friends here, activities, my whole family is here." "But think about the opportunities," David continued, seemingly oblivious to her distress. "We could start fresh. I could maybe get into real estate development, or we could open a family business. The kids would adapt." "What about what I want?" Sarah asked, her voice getting higher. "Did you even consider asking me what I thought about this?" David looked genuinely confused. "I figured you'd be excited. You're always complaining about the schools here, and you said you wanted a bigger house." The conversation deteriorated from there. David couldn't understand why Sarah wasn't thrilled about his grand plans, and Sarah couldn't understand how he could make such huge decisions without really including her in the process. They ended up cutting the date short and barely speaking for the rest of the trip. Back home, the tension between them was worse than ever. David started making concrete plans for the move, assuming Sarah would eventually come around. He'd leave real estate printouts on the kitchen counter and talk about Colorado like it was a done deal. Sarah felt like she was being dragged along on someone else's adventure, with no say in her own life. The worst part was how David seemed to interpret her resistance as lack of faith in his judgment. "I thought you trusted me," he'd say when she'd express concerns about the move. "I thought you believed in us." "I do trust you," Sarah would reply, "but this affects all of us. Shouldn't we make this decision together?" "We are making it together. I'm telling you what I think, and you're telling me why it won't work. That's not teamwork, Sarah. That's you shooting down everything I try to do for this family." Those conversations always ended the same way, with both of them feeling misunderstood and more disconnected than before. Sarah started dreading the sound of David's key in the door. David started staying at work later, claiming he needed to finish up projects before they moved, but Sarah suspected he was just avoiding the tension at home. The kids could sense something was wrong. Their oldest, 16-year-old Jake, started asking pointed questions about why Mom and Dad were always whispering in the kitchen, why family dinners had become silent affairs, why nobody seemed happy anymore. "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" 12-year-old Emma asked one evening while Sarah was helping her with homework. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because you guys don't laugh together anymore, and Dad sleeps on the couch sometimes, and you cry in your room at night." Sarah realized with horror that she had been crying at night, and apparently not as quietly as she'd thought. Her children were watching their parents' marriage fall apart, and she didn't know how to stop it. That night, after the kids were in bed, Sarah tried one more time to talk to David about their future. She found him in his home office, looking at Colorado real estate websites again. "David, we need to talk about this move. Really talk about it." He looked up from the computer screen with an expression that was part hope, part exhaustion. "Are you ready to discuss it reasonably?" I'm ready to discuss it honestly, Sarah replied. But I need you to understand that this isn't just about logistics. This is about our marriage, our family, our whole life. What followed was the most honest conversation they'd had in years, but also the most painful. David admitted that he felt like nothing he did was ever good enough for Sarah, that he was tired of being criticized and micromanaged. Sarah admitted that she felt invisible and unheard, like her opinions and feelings didn't matter to him. I don't know how to make you happy anymore, David said, his voice breaking slightly. I work as hard as I can, I try to provide for you and the kids, but you always seem angry with me. Maybe a fresh start would be good for us. I don't want a fresh start, Sarah said through tears. I want my husband back. I want to feel like we're on the same team again. So do I, David replied. But I don't know how to get there from here. They both sat in silence, the weight of years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding hanging between them. Sarah looked at this man she'd loved for more than half her life and felt like she was looking at a stranger. When had they stopped being friends? When had they stopped enjoying each other's company? When had love become this exhausting battle for understanding? As Sarah lay in bed that night, listening to David's steady breathing beside her, she realized that something had to change. They couldn't keep living like this, two people going through the motions of marriage without any real connection or joy. The question was whether they could find their way back to each other, or if they'd grown too far apart to bridge the gap. The next morning brought a crisis that would test everything they thought they knew about their marriage and themselves. Sarah woke up to find David already gone to work, but to the emergency room. He'd been feeling sick for days but hadn't wanted to worry her. Their oldest son Jake had driven him to the hospital when David realized he couldn't even stand up without help. As Sarah raced to the hospital, her mind was spinning with fear and regret. What if something serious was wrong? What if their last real conversation had been that painful argument about Colorado? What if she'd spent so much time being angry that she'd missed the signs that her husband was really struggling? The emergency room was a chaos of beeping machines and worried whispers. Sarah found David in a hospital bed, looking pale and vulnerable in a way that reminded her of the shy teenager she'd first fallen in love with. For the first time in years, all her anger and frustration melted away, replaced by the simple, overwhelming realization that she couldn't imagine her life without this man. I'm sorry, she whispered, taking his hand. I'm so sorry about everything. David squeezed her hand weakly. Me too. Sarah, if something happens to me, I need you to know that you're the best thing that ever happened to me. You and the kids. Everything I've done, everything I've worked for, it's all been for you. The doctor's diagnosis was serious, but treatable combination of stress, exhaustion, and a bacterial infection that had been building for weeks. David would need to stay in the hospital for several days while they got his condition under control. As Sarah sat by his bedside, she made a decision that would change everything about their marriage. She was going to stop trying to control their life and start focusing on what she could actually change, herself. The hospital stay became an unexpected turning point, but not in the way Sarah had imagined. As David recovered, something shifted in her perspective. Watching him lying there, vulnerable and genuinely apologetic, she realized that her anger had been masking something deeper, profound exhaustion with trying to manage everything and everyone around her. If the kids lose their faith, it'll be because you're joyless, David said quietly on his third day in the hospital. It wasn't meant as an attack, but the words hit Sarah like a slap. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to list all the ways she'd been holding their family together while he was checked out, but something stopped her. Instead, she heard the truth in his words. When was the last time she'd laughed? When was the last time she'd felt genuinely happy about anything? She'd become so focused on fixing David, fixing their problems, fixing their life, that she'd forgotten how to simply be present and enjoy what they had. You're right, she said, surprising them both. I have been joyless, but I don't know how to be anything else anymore. David reached for her hand. We used to have so much fun together. Remember when we'd put on music and dance in the kitchen while we made dinner? Remember how we'd stay up late just talking about everything and nothing? Sarah did remember, and the memory brought tears to her eyes. I miss that. I miss us. So do I, David said. But I don't know how to get back there when you're always upset with me about something. That night, Sarah made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. She was going to get happy, no matter what. Not because everything was perfect, not because David had suddenly transformed into the ideal husband, but because she refused to let her joy depend on circumstances she couldn't control. She started small. The next morning, instead of her usual rushed routine of getting everyone ready for school, she put on music and made pancakes from scratch. The kids were delighted by the unexpected treat, and even though they were running 10 minutes late, Sarah found herself singing along to the radio instead of barking orders. "Mom, you're in a good mood today," 8-year-old Tommy observed, syrup dripping down his chin. "I'm choosing to be," Sarah replied, and realized how strange that sounded. When had happiness become a choice rather than a feeling? When David came home from the hospital 2 days later, he found a different woman than the one he'd left. Sarah had spent hours thinking about what she actually wanted from her life, separate from what she thought David should be doing differently. The answer surprised her. She wanted to feel peaceful in her own home. She wanted to enjoy her children instead of constantly nagging them. She wanted to look forward to her husband coming home instead of dreading another evening of tension. "I've been thinking," she told David as they sat on the porch that evening, watching the kids play in the yard. "Maybe you're right about Colorado. Maybe a fresh start would be good for us." David looked shocked. "Really? You've changed your mind?" "I've changed my perspective," Sarah said. "I realized I've been so focused on controlling every detail of our life that I forgot to actually live it. If you think Colorado is where we need to be, then I trust you." It was the first time she'd said those words, "I trust you," in years, and she could see the effect they had on David. His whole posture straightened, and for the first time in months, he looked truly excited about something. "I want to show you something," he said, pulling out his phone. "I found this house online. It's got everything you said you wanted: big kitchen, separate playroom for the kids, even a garden space where you could grow vegetables." Sarah looked at the photos and felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: genuine excitement. The house was beautiful, but more than that, David had clearly paid attention to things she'd mentioned wanting. He'd been listening, even when she thought he wasn't. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The decision to trust David with the move was just the beginning. Sarah realized that her need to control everything had been exhausting not just for her, but for everyone in the family. She'd been micromanaging the kids' homework, their chores, their friendships, their activities. She'd been second-guessing David's parenting decisions, his business choices, even his clothing selections. "I'm going to try something different," she announced to the family one evening. "From now on, I'm going to focus on being happy and let everyone else manage their own responsibilities." 14-year-old Emma looked skeptical. "Does that mean you're not going to help us with homework anymore?" "I'm going to help if you ask for help," Sarah clarified. "But I'm not going to check up on whether you've done it. That's between you and your teachers." The kids tested this new approach immediately. Jake forgot to do his math homework 3 days in a row. Emma left her science project until the last minute. 10-year-old Michael wore the same shirt to school for a week straight. Every instinct Sarah had screamed at her to intervene, to remind, to manage, but she forced herself to step back and let them experience the natural consequences of their choices. Jake got detention for missing homework. Emma had to stay up until midnight working on her project. Michael's teacher sent a note home about hygiene. "This is hard," Sarah confided to her sister during one of their phone calls. "I feel like I'm being irresponsible as a mother." "But are the kids learning?" her sister asked. Sarah had to admit they were. Jake had started writing down his assignments without being reminded. Emma had learned to budget her time better. Michael had discovered that clean clothes actually felt better than dirty ones. The real test came when David started making concrete plans for the Colorado move. The old Sarah would have insisted on being involved in every decision: which neighborhoods to consider, which schools to research, which moving company to hire. The new Sarah decided to trust David to handle the logistics while she focused on preparing the family emotionally for the transition. "I want to live near the mountains," she told David one evening. "And I'd love to have a fireplace where we can have family game nights in the winter." "I want that too," David replied, and Sarah could see he was already making mental notes. "What else?" It was such a simple question, but it opened up a conversation they hadn't had in years. David actually wanted to know what she wanted, not just what she thought he should do differently. Sarah found herself sharing dreams she'd forgotten she had: learning to ski, having a garden, maybe even getting a dog. "I can make all of that happen," David said, and the confidence in his voice reminded Sarah why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. This was the man who'd built a successful business from nothing, who'd worked himself sick to provide for their family, who'd never once complained about the responsibility of supporting 9 people. The move to Colorado happened faster than Sarah had expected. David found them a rental house that checked every box on her wish list: mountain views, fireplace, big yard, even a hot tub that the kids were thrilled about. More importantly, he handled every aspect of the move without asking Sarah to manage a single detail. "You don't have to pack anything," he told her as moving day approached. "I've hired people to handle all of that. Just focus on getting yourself and the kids ready for the adventure." Sarah was amazed. This was the same man who used to need her to remind him to pick up his dry cleaning, and now he was orchestrating a cross-country move for 9 people without breaking a sweat. The first few weeks in Colorado were challenging. The kids missed their friends and complained about everything from the altitude to the different grocery stores. Sarah felt homesick and wondered if they'd made a mistake. But instead of sharing these doubts with David, she focused on finding things to be grateful for. "Look at this view," she'd say to the kids as they ate breakfast, pointing to the snow-capped mountains visible from their kitchen window. "We're living in a postcard." "The air here is so clean," she'd mentioned to David after her morning walks. "I can actually breathe deeply." She made a conscious effort to find something positive about each day, even when the kids were struggling with the adjustment. When 12-year-old Sophie cried because she missed her best friend back home, Sarah held her and acknowledged the sadness without trying to fix it. "It's okay to miss what we left behind," she told Sophie, "but let's also stay open to all the new things we're going to discover here." The breakthrough came when David surprised her one Saturday morning. "Get dressed," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "I want to show you something." He drove her to a music store in downtown Denver, where a beautiful baby grand piano sat in the front window. "I know you've always wanted to learn to play," he said. "What do you think about that one?" Sarah stared at the piano, then at her husband. "David, we can't afford something like that. We just moved across the country." "Let me worry about what we can afford," he said gently. "I asked you what you think about the piano." It was gorgeous rich wood, perfect condition, exactly the kind of instrument Sarah had dreamed about as a child. "I love it," she admitted. "But I don't even know how to play." "So you'll learn," David said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "The kids could take lessons too. Wouldn't that be fun?" 2 hours later, they were arranging delivery of the piano to their new house. Sarah couldn't believe it was actually happening. For years, she'd talked herself out of wanting things like this, convinced they were impractical or too expensive. But David had been paying attention to her dreams, and now he was making them reality. "Why are you doing this?" she asked as they drove home. "Because I love you," David said simply. "And because I want you to be happy." "I've always wanted you to be happy, Sarah. I just didn't know how to make that happen when you seemed so angry all the time." That evening, as they sat in their new living room listening to the kids excitedly discussing piano lessons, Sarah realized something profound had shifted in their marriage. She'd stopped trying to control David's behavior, and in response, he'd stepped up in ways she never could have imagined. "I have an idea," she said, reaching for his hand. What if we made Sunday evenings our family time? No phones, no work, just us playing games or listening to music or whatever feels good in the moment. I'd love that, David said, squeezing her hand. And I have an idea too. What if we started having date nights again? Real dates where we dress up and go out and remember why we like each other. Sarah felt tears coming to her eyes. Yes, I want that more than anything. As winter settled over Colorado, their new traditions began to take shape. Sunday evenings became sacred family time, complete with hot chocolate and board games by the fireplace. David planned creative date nights that reminded Sarah of their teenage years: mini golf, ice skating, even a cooking class where they laughed until their sides hurt. The kids were thriving in their new schools, and Sarah found herself actually enjoying the daily routines instead of feeling overwhelmed by them. When Jake struggled with chemistry, she resisted the urge to hover, and instead suggested he ask his teacher for help. When Emma wanted to try out for the school play, Sarah cheered her on instead of worrying about the time commitment. "Mom, you're different here," Sophie observed one evening as they baked cookies together. "You're more fun." "I'm the same person," Sarah replied. "I just decided to focus on being happy instead of trying to fix everything." "Can you teach me how to do that?" Sophie asked. And Sarah realized she was modeling something valuable for her children, the idea that happiness was a choice, not a circumstance. The real test of their new dynamic came when David started having serious conversations about his next career move. The old Sarah would have had opinions about everything: which opportunities he should pursue, which ones were too risky, how his decision would affect the family. The new Sarah simply listened and asked questions. "What excites you most?" she asked when he described 3 different business opportunities. "Honestly, I'd love to get into real estate development. There's so much potential here in Colorado, and I think I could really make a difference in how communities are planned and built." "That sounds perfect for you," Sarah said. "You've always been good at seeing the big picture and making things happen." David looked at her with something like wonder. "You really think I should go for it?" "I think you should do whatever feels right to you," Sarah replied. "I trust your judgment." Those words, "I trust your judgment," seemed to unlock something in David. Over the following weeks, he threw himself into researching the real estate market with an enthusiasm Sarah hadn't seen in years. He made connections, attended networking events, and started developing a business plan that was both ambitious and realistic. "I feel like I'm finally doing what I was meant to do," he told Sarah one evening as they soaked in the hot tub under a canopy of stars. "And I feel like I have my best friend back." Sarah realized he was right. They were friends again, partners in the truest sense. By giving up her need to control every aspect of their life, she'd created space for David to step into his role as leader and provider. And by trusting him to make good decisions, she'd freed herself to focus on what she did best: creating a warm, loving home where everyone felt valued and supported. As winter turned to spring in their new Colorado home, Sarah looked around at her family and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete contentment. Not because everything was perfect, but because she'd learned to find joy in what they had rather than focusing on what was missing. The transformation was just beginning. Spring in Colorado brought new challenges that would test everything Sarah had learned about letting go of control. David's real estate development venture was taking off faster than either of them had expected, which meant longer hours and more travel. The old Sarah would have seen this as abandonment, as David choosing work over family yet again. The new Sarah chose to see it differently. "I'm proud of you," she told him one morning as he packed for a 3-day trip to meet with potential investors. "You're building something amazing." David paused in his packing, looking at her with surprise. "You're not upset that I'm traveling so much?" "I'm excited for you," Sarah said, and realized she meant it. "This is what you've always wanted to do. I'm not going to make you feel guilty for pursuing your dreams." But the real test came when David's business partners suggested they take on a project that would require a significant financial investment money they'd earmarked for the kids' college funds. David came home that evening looking conflicted and exhausted. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, sitting down heavily at the kitchen table. Mike thinks we should bid on this development project downtown. It's a big opportunity, but it would mean using most of our savings. The old Sarah would have immediately listed all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. College was expensive. What if the project failed? What if they lost everything? But the new Sarah took a deep breath and asked a different question. What do you think we should do? David looked at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. I'm asking for your opinion, Sarah. This affects our whole family, and I'm telling you that I trust your judgment. She replied, You know more about business than I do. You know what risks are worth taking. If you think this is the right move, then I support you. David stared at her for a long moment. You're serious? Completely serious. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. I married a man who built a successful business from nothing. I'm not going to start doubting your abilities now. That night, David stayed up late working on financial projections and business plans. Sarah could hear him on the phone with his partner, discussing market conditions and construction timelines. Instead of feeling excluded or worried, she felt grateful that David was passionate about his work again. The project moved forward, and with it came a level of uncertainty that would have sent the old Sarah into a panic. There were permit delays, contractor issues, and weeks when it looked like the whole thing might fall apart. But David handled each crisis with a calm competence that reminded Sarah why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. How do you stay so calm? She asked him one evening after he'd spent the day dealing with a particularly difficult city planning meeting. Because I know you believe in me, he said simply. When your wife thinks you can handle anything, it makes you feel like you actually can. Sarah realized that her trust hadn't just freed David to pursue his dreams, it had actually made him more capable of achieving them. When she'd constantly questioned his decisions, he'd become hesitant and defensive. When she supported his judgment, he became confident and decisive. The success of David's business venture brought unexpected benefits to their family life. Not just financially, though the project did turn out to be extremely profitable, but emotionally. David came home each day energized and engaged, eager to share his experiences and hear about everyone else's day. Tell me about your piano lesson, he'd say to Sophie, giving her his full attention. Did you master that piece you were working on? How was the math test? He'd ask Jake, actually listening to the answer instead of just nodding absently. Sarah watched her husband become the father and partner she'd always known he could be, and realized that her previous attempts to control him had been preventing this transformation. By constantly managing and criticizing, she'd been keeping him small. By trusting and supporting, she'd allowed him to become the man he was meant to be. The real breakthrough came when David made a suggestion that would have terrified the old Sarah. I've been thinking, he said one Saturday morning as they sat on their deck watching the kids play in the yard. What if we homeschooled the kids again? I know you love teaching them, and now that my business is stable, we could afford for you to stay home full-time. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Homeschooling 7 kids had been overwhelming before, especially when she was trying to manage everyone's education while also running the household. But then she remembered something important. She wasn't the same person who'd been overwhelmed before. I'd love that, she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. But I'd want to do it differently this time. Less structured, more focused on what each kid is actually interested in learning. Whatever you think is best, David said. I trust your judgment when it comes to education. There it was again, that phrase that had become like magic between them. I trust your judgment. It was transforming their entire relationship, giving each of them permission to excel in their areas of strength without interference or criticism. Sarah threw herself into planning a new kind of homeschool experience for their children. Instead of rigid curricula and standardized tests, she focused on nurturing each child's natural curiosity and talents. Emma, who loved theater, spent mornings reading Shakespeare and afternoons writing her own plays. Jake, who had a gift for mathematics, worked through advanced calculus while also exploring how mathematical principles applied to architecture and engineering. The house buzzed with creative energy. The piano David had bought became the centerpiece of their music education, with different kids practicing at different times throughout the day. The dining room table was constantly covered with art projects, science experiments, and history timelines. Sarah felt like she was running a small, joyful university instead of a stressful school. Sarah realized when she'd tried to force David to be the husband she thought he should be, she'd killed his natural desire to please and provide for her. When she'd created space for him to lead in his own way, he'd become more generous and attentive than she'd ever imagined possible. The proof came in countless small moments. David started planning surprise date nights without being asked. He noticed when Sarah was tired and would suggest she take a hot bath while he handled bedtime routines. He bought her flowers for no reason other than he'd seen them and thought of her. "I feel like I'm dating you all over again," Sarah told him one evening as they slow danced in their living room to music from the piano. "Except better, because now I know how to appreciate what I have." "You're different too," David said, spinning her around. "You're lighter. More fun. More like the girl I fell in love with, but with the wisdom that comes from growing up together." Their relationship had found a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. David handled the business and financial decisions. Sarah managed the household and children's education, and they made major life choices together through conversation rather than conflict. Neither of them felt burdened by responsibilities they didn't enjoy, and both of them felt valued for their contributions. The transformation extended to their entire family dynamic. The kids, who'd grown accustomed to their parents' constant tension, were now witnessing a marriage filled with laughter, affection, and mutual respect. Sunday family nights became legendary adventures. Sometimes they'd have dance parties in the living room, sometimes they'd build blanket forts and tell stories. Sometimes they'd just sit around talking about their dreams and plans. "I want to have a marriage like yours and Dad's when I grow up," Emma told Sarah one afternoon as they worked on a history project together. "You guys actually like each other." "We do," Sarah agreed. "But it wasn't always this way. We had to learn how to be good partners." "What did you learn?" Emma asked with the directness that only teenagers possess. Sarah thought about how to explain it. "I learned that I can't control other people, not even people I love. I can only control my own actions and attitudes. And I learned that when I trust your dad to make good decisions, he usually does." "That sounds hard," Emma said. "It was terrifying at first," Sarah admitted. "But it turns out that letting go of control was the most freeing thing I've ever done. When I stopped trying to manage everyone else's life, I finally had time to enjoy my own." The lesson proved itself again and again. When 10-year-old Michael wanted to quit piano lessons to focus on soccer, Sarah's instinct was to insist he stick with music. Instead, she asked him what he really wanted and then supported his decision. Michael threw himself into soccer with an enthusiasm that made it clear he'd made the right choice. When Jake expressed interest in taking a gap year before college to work in his father's business, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of anxiety. What about his education? What about his future? But instead of voicing these concerns, she asked Jake what he hoped to gain from the experience. His thoughtful answer about wanting to understand business from the ground up before studying it academically convinced her that he was making a mature decision. "I'm proud of how you're handling this," David told her privately. "The old you would have had a list of reasons why Jake needed to go straight to college. The old me was afraid that if I didn't control every decision, something terrible would happen," Sarah replied. "Now I realize that the terrible thing was me trying to control everything." As their second year in Colorado began, Sarah looked around at her life with a sense of amazement. Their house was filled with laughter and music. The kids were thriving in their education and activities. David's business was growing beyond his wildest dreams. And their marriage had become a source of strength and joy rather than stress and conflict. The piano that had symbolized David's generosity now served as a gathering place for the family. Sarah had indeed learned to play, and she and David sometimes entertained the kids with duets that made everyone laugh. Do you ever miss the old life? David asked one evening as they sat by the fireplace, watching the kids work on various projects around the room. Sarah considered the question seriously. I miss the simplicity of having fewer responsibilities, but I don't miss the constant stress and conflict. I don't miss feeling like I was fighting against you instead of working with you. I don't miss feeling like I could never do anything right, David said. Now I feel like I can take on the world because I know you believe in me. You can take on the world, Sarah said, meaning it completely. You already have. As they prepared for bed that night, Sarah reflected on how radically their lives had changed. It hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. Learning to let go of control had required daily practice and constant reminders that she could only change herself. But the results had been worth every moment of discomfort. She was no longer the overwhelmed, resentful woman who'd felt trapped in her own life. She was a woman who woke up each morning grateful for her husband, her children, and the life they'd built together. She was a woman who trusted in her family's ability to handle challenges and pursue dreams. She was a woman who'd learned that true power came not from controlling others, but from mastering herself. Looking at David sleeping peacefully beside her, Sarah smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, and new chances to practice the lessons she'd learned. But tonight, she was simply grateful for the journey that had brought them from the brink of divorce to a marriage that felt like a daily celebration of love, trust, and partnership. The girl who'd fallen in love at 15 and the woman who'd learned to surrender at 37 were the same person, but the marriage they'd created was entirely new. And it was more beautiful than anything Sarah had ever imagined possible.